The Kaška were never conquered. They were never fully defeated. But they left no cities, no monuments, no texts of their own. And yet, for centuries, they were seemingly constantly on the cusp of destroying the Hittite Empire. They would attack suddenly in surprising force and then melt away just as quickly. Armies, even entire communities, would seemingly disappear and refuse to be pinned down. And like the Hittites, modern scholarship has been unable to pin down the Kaška, leaving us to ask the most basic questions, like, who actually were the Kaška? Let's dig in. The Kaška produced zero sources of their own. We know them exclusively from the records of their neighbors and mostly from their perennial enemies, the Hittites. So any history or explanation of their culture will be pretty limited, but because they were in such frequent conflict with the Hittites, we can sketch out a rough outline of Kaskean history. Now you may wonder about archaeological evidence as a check to the biased sources of the Hittites. But archaeologically, the Kaška are essentially invisible. But the Kaška don't show up archaeologically not because they weren't there, but probably because archaeology is better at finding states than frontiers. Archaeologists are great at identifying tells, or höyüks in Turkish, that is, ruined mounds of past human settlement. They're also great at identifying patterns of human habitation in the form of surveys, which identify sherd and lithic scatters. But because we haven't really isolated and intensively excavated any definitively Kaskean sites, we don't have a cultural template which we can identify as Kaskean. No art, no monumental architecture, no distinctive ceramic tradition. There just isn't an assemblage of artifacts that scholars can use to define the boundaries of Kaskean culture. And if we don't have a clear understanding of what Kaskean culture looked like, we aren't really able to identify them in surveys and other archaeological methods, no matter how many ceramics we may identify. So it's not that the Kaška weren't there, only that we haven't identified them yet because we may not always be looking in the right spot or for the right things. And this may be more related to their mode of existence, which we'll return to in a moment. But together, all of this, exclusively outsider perspectives and the lack of any real material record, limits our understanding of Kaskean self-identification. How did they think of themselves? What might they have used to establish their identification boundary markers? And this brings us back to perhaps the most basic but significant question when dealing with the Kaška. Who were they? It's tempting to treat them like a more or less coherent ethnicity, a people group with a shared identity. But more and more, scholars are beginning to suspect the Kaška may not have been a people at all, but more like a phenomenon of Hittite imperialism. Put another way, the Kaška may be a frontier phenomenon produced by the expansion of the Hittite Empire, whose identity was fluid, situational, and only visible through Hittite imperial sources. When it comes to investigating the Kaška, one thing we can say confidently is that from the Hittite sources we know the Kaskean homeland was in north of Anatolia in the Pontic Mountains south of the Black Sea. Some would limit it to between the modern towns of Sinop and Ordu, down to the modern villages around Amasya and Tastova. But again, this is only a rough approximation, and there are citations in the description below if you want to go find the survey data which led to this conclusion. But as with everything with the Kaška, this was no doubt fluid and fluctuated over time. And it may be prudent to extend the Kaška lands further to the west, but in general this area seems to be the primary zone of interaction between the Kaška and the Hittites, the area the Hittites called the Kaška land. However, this area was always ill-defined. One scholar has likened it to leopard spots, inconsistently distributed patches of danger in a landscape the Hittites wanted to claim. The Kaška appear suddenly in Hittite history, but it's not actually clear when. The first purported reference to the Kaška dates to the reign of the Old Kingdom Hittite king Mursili I. In a much later text, known as the Decree of Mursili III concerning the people of Tiliura, we read that during the reign of Mursili, nearly 300 years prior to the reign of Mursili III, that since the time of Mursili, the town of Tiliura lay waste. We also note that Mursili had set up outposts against those who had joined the borderlands, and that during the reigns of Labarna and Mursili, they were kept across the Kumeshmaha River. This is agreed to be a reference to the Kaška. So these later texts indicate that Labarna and Hattusili were unable to expand across the Humeshmaha River, and Hantili was forced to fortify the northern border. Now these texts are significantly later than the period they make reference to, and so many scholars have doubted the accuracy of this retrojection of conflict back into the Old Kingdom period. In support of this are other Old Kingdom texts which make reference to kings like Hattusili campaigning near the Black Sea but make no reference to the Kaška. There are a few other texts which have been taken to refer to Kaskean incursions, but these aren't certain and importantly don't mention the Kaška. For example, Hantili II fortifies Hattusha, which can be interpreted as preparing for Kaskean incursions. And Mubatali I campaigned in the vicinity of Nerik, which has been taken as a response to the Kaška without referring to them by name. But again, this is all speculation. So, despite references to campaigns in areas which would become known as Kaška land, the Kaška go unmentioned. The Kaška don't really appear in contemporary records until the early 15th century with border incursions during the reign of Tutulia I. Our first contemporary, or near-contemporary, reference to the Kaška comes from the early Empire period in the Annals of Tutulia. There, the scribe records how the king was in the west, campaigning against the Ashuan Confederacy, and while the king and the army were away, the Kaška attacked. Tutulia responded in two separate campaigns and claims he drove the Kaška back. Scholars postulate that under the reign of Tutulia, the Hittites and Egypt reached an agreement known as the Kurustama Treaty. And this is known only from allusions and quotes in later sources. But part of this treaty was, apparently, the transfer of a contingent of Kaskean soldiers to Egypt. Modern interpreters understand this as the Egyptians taking control of a group of specialized warriors adept at ambush combat. Apparently, Kaška's reputation as fierce fighters had already reached as far as the Nile. However, while Tutulia claimed victory, it would not last. And this is a theme that we'll see. The Hittite northern frontier deteriorated during the reigns of Hattusili II and especially Arnuwanda I. In the so-called Prayers of Arnuwanda and Ashmunakal, Arnuwanda reports to the sun goddess Arina that the Kaška have taken Nerik, perhaps the most important Hittite cult center in the northern part of the empire. Several oath agreements and treaties from the Kaška were signed during the reign of Arnuwanda or possibly Tutulia III, but these proved to be mostly unhelpful for the Hittites. These texts are similar to standard Hittite treaties but differ in a few ways, so they're often dealt with as their own sort of literature. The agreements were mostly concerned with the flow of personnel across the frontier zone, and the agreements were not with the Kaška as a whole, but with individual groups of Kaška, an issue we'll return to in a moment. The Kaška, it seems, were gaining the upper hand in the frontier and were able to pressure the Hittites deeper to the Halys Basin, as these oaths did not bind the entirety of the Kaška. In the so-called Maşat correspondence, we get a very granular level of insight into how the Hittites dealt with the Kaška during this period.
The Maşat correspondence is a collection of texts found in excavation at Maşat Höyük, likely the Hittite city of Tapaka. The texts are mostly between a king named Tutulia, though which one specifically isn't entirely clear, though it's likely Tutulia III, who corresponded with the Hittite officials in the city.
This archive likely covers only a decade or so, as the named officials don't change, so almost certainly covers a span of only one generation of professional careers. The texts are primarily concerned with how to deal with the border and the Kaška, usually just referred to as the enemy, as Tapaka was in the contested border zone. In these letters, we get important insights into who the Kaška were and how frustrated the Hittites were with them. One text, from the king to the Hittite official in the city, is particularly illuminating, reading, "Concerning what you wrote to me saying, the enemy has come, he pressed the city of Hapara on that side and the city of Kashapura on this side, but he himself passed through and I don't know where he went. And was that enemy enchanted that you didn't recognize him?" Other letters make it clear the Kaška knew the land well. They were able to seemingly appear and disappear at will, and the Hittites were unable to locate them in any significant number. That is, they couldn't march an army out and meet them face to face. Even whole communities, it seemed, would disappear, as if all their property was movable. The elusiveness attributed to the Kaška was not purely defensive. The Kaška could coalesce seemingly out of nowhere, prepared to fight the Hittites and conduct raids deep into land claimed by the Hittites. The correspondence is really an incredible resource if you're interested in Hittite-Kaška relations. There is an English edition published if you want to dig into it more, and you can find that reference in the description below. The Maşat correspondence has been particularly vital in helping to understand the Kaška and their way of life, which is important in understanding who the Kaška may have been, either as a unified socio-political unit or a multi-ethnic border phenomenon. It seems part of what made the Kaška so hard to pin down, and what may make them so hard to find archaeologically, was their mode of living. Most scholars have posited the Kaškans practiced some kind of seasonal vertical transhumance. Basically, they would move herds, probably sheep and goat, to different pastures at different elevations depending on the season, usually in the valleys in the winter and higher altitudes in the summer. However, other Kaškan communities were apparently a bit more sedentary. Within the Maşat correspondence are references to locusts eating the Kaškan crops, which implies the planting of crops and thus a more sedentary mode of existence. Additionally, in Mursili II's prayer to the sun goddess, he refers to the Kaška as swineherds and linen weavers. Now, as a rule, the Hittites did not use ethnic pejoratives, even when referring to hated enemies. But we may have an exception here. It's noteworthy, pigs were generally not consumed by the Hittites, usually limited to a few prescribed ritual occasions. So pigs were not a common Hittite foodstuff. Further, ethnographic studies suggest women may have tended to pigs, especially while men were engaged in the transhumance activities of seasonal mobility with sheep and goats. In the ancient world, weaving was a feminine activity conducted in the household, so swineherds and linen weavers may be a pejorative statement basically calling the Kaška a bunch of women, something the Hittites would have taken as an insult. If this was intended as a kind of pejorative, its rarity may attest to how hated the Kaška were by the Hittites. But it also more directly implies both pig husbandry and flax cultivation. Pigs are not great herding animals. They may roam in wooded areas, but were generally tended in the village so they didn't go feral. And flax obviously is a planted crop which needs planted, tended, harvested, and processed into linen. So swineherds and linen weavers strongly implies a more sedentary population. Scholars have posited that Kaškan towns may have been ephemeral, made of perishable materials which don't last archaeologically, which may again attest to their near invisibility in archaeological terms. But this would contradict Hittite sources referring to towns and fortified settlements of the Kaška. Anatolia III references fortified Kaškan towns in the mountains. However, there is a literary motif of kings going into the mountains along dangerous paths to overcome the enemy, so we might be cautious imagining mountaintop Kaškan fortress sites, and there might be a literary trope going on. Though there are numerous references in the Maşat correspondence and other places where the Kaška retreat to the mountains, and the Hittite army is unable to track them as they disperse into the wild. The Hittites do refer to Kaškan towns, but we don't get much more than that. The deeds of Shupiliyuma mention a town called Timuhala as a place of pride for Kaška, and Mursili claims in his 10-year annals to have destroyed Halila and Tushuka in the territory of Termita, which are the principal land of the Kaška, but we don't know for sure where any of these places are or what kind of place they may have been. We basically just get the names. This matters because the conflicting data makes it more difficult to envision the Kaška as a single ethnic group or a monolithic entity, whereas those who interpret them as an ethnically mixed border appellation have less of an issue seeing several different modes of existence all coexisting at the same time. There may have been fully mobile Kaška groups as well as settled communities. So in the early 14th century, we see the Hittites were on the ropes. This whole period from Arnuwanda through Anatolia III can be characterized as the time of the Hittite wars for survival. Hittiteologists talk about a concentric attack, which is based on a later text from the reign of Mursili III. From it we read, "In earlier days the Hatti lands were sacked by its enemies. The Kaškan enemy came and sacked the Hatti lands, and he made Nanasa his frontier. From the lower land came the Arzawan enemy, and he too sacked the Hatti lands, and he made Tuanuwa and Uda his frontier. From afar, the Arwanan enemy came and sacked the whole land of Gasia. From afar, the Azian enemy came and sacked all the upper lands, and he made Samuha his frontier. The Yeshuan enemy came and sacked the land of Tegarama. From afar, the Armatana enemy came, and he too sacked the Hatti lands. And he made Kizuwatna the city his frontier, and Hattusa the city was burned down. The Hittites give an impression of coordination, but we should be skeptical that the Hittite enemies actually coordinated instead of simply taking advantage of weakness as it presented itself. Depending on how we interpret this later text of Hattusili, it may be that the Kaška invaded first, leading to the Hittites to concentrate their forces to the north, leaving the rest of the empire exposed. This weakened the empire, resulting in the Kaška sacking the capital of Hattusa. It is probably in this time frame we ought to understand the minor letters EA31 and 32. These letters are between Amenhotep III and Tarhunda Radu, the king of Varzawa. The pharaoh seems to think that the Hittites are essentially eliminated as a major power, and so he is seeking an alliance with Varzawa, who is presumed to be the new ascendant power in the region. Within the letter is a request by the pharaoh to send people from the land of Kaška. The Kaška were again believed to be gifted warriors and were sought after by Egypt yet again. It is noteworthy, though, that elsewhere in the minor letters, Kaška is used as interchangeable with a poor man or someone of lower status. So while they may have been widely regarded as warriors, they also had a reputation for being poor or maybe even barbaric. Back in Anatolia, the Kaška were, along with other polities in Anatolia, on the verge of eliminating the Hittites. However, they would not be able to maintain their hold over the Hittite heartland. Shutholia took back Samuha from Azi and used it as a base to attack both Azi and Hayasa, as well as into the Kaška land. Much of the reconquest of the Hittite heartland comes from the deeds of Shupiliuma, and we gather the young prince was tasked with much of the reconquest itself. During this period of recovery, Shupiliuma had to campaign into the north several times, but we are told he was successful in pushing the frontier back. The impression is that the Hittites would come in force and the Kaška would either be defeated or melt away, and the frontier would be at peace for a time. But it was never at peace for long. After the Great Syrian War, in which Shupiliuma vassalized much of Syria, he was forced to return to Anatolia to again fight the Kaška, who had attacked while his army was campaigning in the south. Mursili II reports as much, saying in his comprehensive annals, "Furthermore, since my father was in Hurrian territory, as long as he fought with the Hurrian countries and stayed there, many enemies were levied from behind, from Kaška, and they oppressed the land of Hatti, in part they destroyed, and part they even occupied and held in possession." Further complicating matters for the Hittites was the introduction of a plague to Anatolia by captives brought from the Levant. Shupiliuma and Arnuwanda, his son, ultimately succumbed to the disease. The Kaška rightfully saw this as the Hittites being vulnerable, and as they so often did, attacked where their enemies were weak. While Arnuwanda was sick, he ordered one of his most capable commanders to invade the Kaška, but he died shortly after beginning his attack. After Arnuwanda died, the new young king Mursili was faced with crisis across the empire, a story for another time. But from his reign we have numerous references to the Kaška. He campaigned against the Kaška almost every year of his reign. In years 1 through 6, he warded off Kaška raids but gained no permanent holdings. He reports the Kaška were able to raid near Hattusa while he was campaigning against rebellious vassals in western Anatolia. In year 7, something significant changed though. The Kaška were now ruled by a single man, a man named Pihunia. Mursili records this conflict in some detail. He tells us, this Pihunia did not rule in the Kaškan manner. Whereas among the Kaška, the government was not in the hand of a single man, this Pihunia surprisingly ruled as a king. I, my majesty, went and sent him a messenger and wrote to him, "Give me back my subjects that you have captured and led to the Kaška land." But Pihunia sent back to me and wrote me as following, "I will return to you nothing, and if you will attack me, I will not fight against you in my territory, rather I will fight you in your territory." This reference is important for helping understand Kaškan sociopolitical organization. Mursili's note here that having a single king was uncommon speaks against the idea that the Kaška were some kind of monolithic or unified entity. Citing this passage in the Kaškan oaths from the reign of Arnuwanda, most scholars postulate the Kaška did not usually have a king, but were instead organized in extended kinship networks, close to what may be typically called tribes, and they were not permanently unified. Only under the figure of Pihunia, which the Hittites recognize as an aberration, were the Kaškans unified under a king-like figure. The rest of the time they were dealt with as sub-state entities, like tribes. The Maşat correspondence strongly points to the Hittites dealing with, at least some of the time, a kind of council of elders or occasionally chiefs, but these were highly localized. This meant that Hittites may make a treaty with one tribe, but another tribe clearly didn't feel obligated to submit to the terms of that treaty. Oaths taken by one faction of Kaška were not binding on the others. The Hittites usually refer to Kaška men, but could also refer to Kaška as a region. It's possible, given the language used in Hittite sources, to interpret Kaška as a geographic term, and thus all the people who lived in that region were Kaška men, even if they would have maintained other kinds of social identification. Again, scholarship is a bit split on how to best understand our data. We have a few throwaway lines here and there in Hittite texts and are left to reconstruct how an entire society organized itself. So depending on which source you read, you may see Kaška treated as a geographical region, a border zone, or as a territorial polity, similar to how the Hittites refer to other contemporary polities. But back to Mursili. He notes he was successful in his fight against Pihunia. Instead of fighting with the typical guerrilla tactics of the Kaška, he actually fought a pitched battle, the Kaška were defeated, and Pihunia was taken as a captive back to Hattusha. This mostly pacified the Kaška during the rest of Mursili's reign, though in the latter years of his reign he would conduct episodic raids into Kaška lands. He claims to have reached farther than any other Hittite king, but it doesn't seem as though he seized land and brought it under Hittite administration. It seems more like attempts to pacify a volatile and restless region. He notes he fought two men, one named Pitagatali, the other named Pitapara, in the region of Tumana. This region was supposedly conquered by Shupiliuma, but Mursili's campaigns there suggested went back and forth between Kaška and Hittite control, and was one of several zones of fluctuating control. These Kaška warlords had amassed an army of 9,000, so it was a substantial force which Mursili was forced to confront. He marched his army through the night and surprised the Kaška, who retreated. Mursili claims to have burnt the Kaška city of Tumuhala, called the Pride of the Kaška, as well as Pitagatali's main base of operations, Sapaduba, but Pitagatali eluded the Hittites and disappeared into the mountains. Mursili realized this region would never be fully pacified, and so to protect the frontier, he sought to refortify it and repopulate it with Hittites. He settled the city of Tiliura, which he claims was abandoned since the reign of Fantili in the Middle Kingdom period. He went to Nerik and worshipped there, an event of huge symbolic significance, but was not yet fully reclaimed by the Hittites. By the time Mursili passed, the Kaška were in no shape to sustain any kind of attack against the Hittites. Muwatalli II inherited a relatively stable frontier. However, Muwatalli had learned from his forebears. He knew this would not last, and he knew there was not a sustainable military answer. He continued the resettlement of Hittite sites on his northern frontier, but he moved his capital from Hattusha to Tarhuntasha. He did not move his capital just because of the Kaška. Kaška raids and perpetual security issues around the capital were no doubt part of it, though he never states as much. But we ought not attribute such an important political and symbolically charged move as simply due to threats of Kaška raids. We can note that Muwatalli used Kaška soldiers in the Battle of Kadesh against Egypt, but the northern frontier was mostly dealt with by his brother Hattusili, who had frequent conflicts with the Kaška. When Muwatalli moved his capital, he placed his brother as king over Hattusha and the northern part of the empire. Following the death of Muwatalli, the empire had an episode of dynastic crisis, wherein Muwatalli's favored successor, but not the son of his primary wife, succeeded to the throne, but then sought to take power away from Hattusili as a potential rival to the throne. Hattusili fought in a civil war with his nephew and even incorporated Kaška soldiers into his army. It was during this time that the city of Nerik was fully wrested away from the Kaška. As king, Hattusili continually had to deal with various elements of the Kaška. A treaty details his resettlement of the border town of Tiliura. In it, he stipulates the Kaška, or at least those officially hostile to the Hittites, were banned from settling or even entering the town. And during the waning years of the empire, the Kaška appear as an ever-present threat. The northern frontier was never fully secure. Suetolia IV campaigned against the Kaška despite the gains made by his father Hattusili. But as always, the Hittites claimed victory over the northern foes, but they reappeared just as quickly as they were ostensibly defeated. The Hittite Empire collapsed in the early years of the 12th century, and so their records stopped. Their capital of Hattusha was destroyed, and the presence of some non-Hittite ceramics and the subsequent ephemeral occupation of the site has led some scholars to suggest the Kaška were either responsible for the destruction of the city, or at least occupied it shortly after it was destroyed. The Kaška seem to be relatively unaffected by the Bronze Age collapse, maybe even being a beneficiary of it as their primary antagonists were eliminated. The Kaška appear in later sources. They are noted as enemies encountered by Tiglath-Pileser I when he campaigned in Anatolia, and he says, "As soon as with my valor, by means of which the god Ashur my lord had placed in my hand the strong weapon which subdues the insubmissive, he commanded me to extend the border of his land. 4,000 Kashku and Urumu, insubmissive troops of Hatti, who had seized by force the cities of the land Shubartu, which were vassals of the god Ashur my lord, heard of my coming to the land Shubartu. The splendor of my valor overwhelmed them, and fearing battle, they submitted to me." And other Assyrian kings make reference to them too. Tiglath-Pileser III records from the late 8th century tribute from Dadi Ilu of the city of Kaška. All of this suggests the Kaška survived as a recognizable entity well after the Bronze Age collapse and beyond their core in the Pontic Mountains, though it's not clear if this is an ethnic continuity or the shifting of the border. This should be a straightforward question, but it's not. Were they an ethnic group, a tribe, a political group? Is it just a geographical region? The data we get on the Kaška is frustrating. Sometimes it's little more than a reference to a raid by the Kaška or into the Kaška lands, and there are gaps in the data we have, and when we do get references, the information is sometimes contradictory. It's kind of like a constellation in the night sky. We have a few points, and we're trying to make a coherent picture, although we aren't told what the picture is exactly. We don't know how to best connect all the dots. And this has invited different scholars to draw different pictures, which are all viable to some extent, but also all have some problems. Einar von Schuler was the first scholar to systematically address the question of who were the Kaška. His work, still only in German, is to this day the starting point for any inquiry into the Kaška. Schuler argues the Kaška were an indigenous group in northern Anatolia, from the Pontic Mountains south of the Black Sea. They were decidedly not Indo-European, like the Hittites, who always maintained them as a hated other. He believes they were a patchwork of tribes with a sense of a shared ethnicity. That is, they shared a sense of kinship with an understanding of both smaller scale and larger scale kinship networks. And there is a lot to be said for this. It's a relatively straightforward reading of the data. The Kaška were like the other Anatolian polities of the Late Bronze Age, if a bit more resilient than the rest. Other scholars disagree with aspects of this. Some scholars, for example, see the Kaška as foreigners to Anatolia, citing their mobility and propensity for what seems to be migration in the Hittite sources. And they suggest they were outsiders who came into northern Anatolia from the Caucasus. And this has been cited as the reason why they appear suddenly in Hittite records and leave little archaeological trace. However, this view is not commonly favored, as most scholars now do see the Kaška as indigenous to Anatolia. Still, other scholars have interpreted other aspects differently from Schuler. Itamar Singer, for example, sees the Kaška as remnants of the Hattians that the Hittites forced out of central Anatolia. Singer sees Hattian patterns in the personal names and divine names of the Kaška pantheon, and suggests the Kaška were remnants of these Hattian groups which were displaced. Of the names of individuals we either know were Kaskean or can reasonably infer were Kaskean, there are a few interesting trends. We see Mua suffixes common on Luwian names, but we also see Ili and Ali suffixes, which are usually associated with Proto-Hattian names, that is, the pre-Hittite population of Anatolia. And these Ili suffix names appear with a surprising frequency in names presumed to be Kaskean. So there's an interesting mixture of Luwian and Hittite, but also significantly Hattian elements in the onomastic data. Singer postulates that as the Old Kingdom consolidated their rule in the Halys Basin, the pre-Hittite Hattians were either absorbed, the proposed fate of the Hattians in the Halys Basin, or were forced out, the proposed fate of the Hattians who lived more on the fringes of the old Hittite expansion. The Kaška would then be Hattian survivors. This is why they appear as a distinct group beginning only in the Old Kingdom texts and are invisible before that, as in the text of the old Assyrian trading colony. These Hattians preserve remnants of their identity as Hattians, but form a new identity in a kind of frontier survival model. Similar to how Basques and Copts preserve their identity, but as a more marginal community. One perspective which I find particularly interesting sees the Kaška not as an indigenous ethnicity or a pre-Hittite community forced into the margins, but as a product of Hittite imperialism. This is most clearly articulated by the Turkish scholar Nebahat Gerçek. In her formulation, the Kaška are not a coherent ethnic group. Instead, she argues, the term in Hittite sources is used in the context of the Hittite northern frontier zone. Kaška is just the term the Hittites use for the people on their northern frontier. In this sense, it is a wholly Hittite invention. Within this umbrella of Kaška may be any number of ethnic entities, tribal groups, and socio-political organizations. In many senses, she builds on the work of Paul Szymanski, who was among the first to argue the Kaška were an invention of the Hittites. But this is not to say the Kaška were not real, only that they were a product of the Hittites. They clearly exist, but they exist because of the Hittites. Were it not for the Hittites, a Kaška group would never have formed. Szymanski points out that when we look to the origins of the Kaška, we don't have great answers. Instead, we see the Kaška behaving like the Kaška when the Hittites start governing like the Hittites. Had the Hittites not expanded their imperial control into the Pontic area, we would not have the Kaška in the way that we know them. Szymanski suggests that there came a certain point after which moving the Hittite border further north became too costly with too little return for the Hittites to continue to push into that region. To put it colloquially, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. But this created an incredibly porous zone of interaction in the frontier, and that interaction may have been what generated the Kaška phenomenon. There was a constant intermixing of people and all too frequent Hittite raids, which led to a rebellious region ever ready to resist Hittite depredation, and when the time was right, strike back at the empire. So when we look at our data sets and the theories that try to sort it all out, we're still confronted with the original question: who were the Kaška? And to be completely honest, I don't know for sure. I do know the Kaška were more complicated than they seem at first glance. More than barbarians who refuse to submit, the Kaška represent a historical phenomenon needing nuance to really appreciate. Sometimes they appear as a coherent ethno-political entity, but this is, even by Hittite admission, an aberration. Most other times, the Kaška seem to be a kind of odd mixture. It makes the most sense, to me at least, to think of them as a response to the Hittites, an amorphous, rebellious area with a conglomeration of local identifications and ethnic groups that lacked anything unifying other than their resistance to the Hittites. And while this has been, believe me, a very frustrating exercise, I think there's also a real sense of excitement here. The Kaška represent a relatively unexplored frontier in archaeology, and that's a really cool prospect. It's exciting to reflect on the fact that, for all we know about the ancient world, which is substantial, there are still gaps, and in this case, pretty huge gaps. But those gaps are just waiting for someone to dig in.